Thank you, Commissioner Boswell. So next up, we'll hear from Matthew Chiasson, who's Senior Policy Advisor at the Competition Bureau. Matthew will discuss how competition issues resonate with Canadians based on the latest polling and market research. Matthew, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Chiasson. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at the Competition Bureau. Just by way of background, I'm an economist. I've been at the Bureau a little over 17 years, and here's my clicker. My job is to advocate for competition, and I work with some tremendous colleagues. We spend a lot of our time digging through the evidence, trying to find out how to make competition work better in Canada, and then pushing those insights within government and out to the wider policy community through events like today's. So I was asked to give a short talk on why we think Canada needs more competition, building on what Commissioner Boswell talked about, but also bringing in some themes from across today. The second instruction I was given was to try to make it interesting. So format-wise, this is going to look a little bit more like a TED Talk. I'm going to build in some real-life stories. I've put together slides. And I've picked as my theme a simple four-word idea: permission to sell lemonade. It's inspired by a story, and hopefully you can see these slides, from a few years ago. And if you're from Ottawa, you might remember it. Two sisters, 5 and 7, had set up a lemonade stand near the Rideau Canal to raise money for summer camp. Now, unbeknownst to them, where they had located happened to be part of National Capital Commission property. So within a couple of hours, they had their stand shut down because they didn't have a permit. So turns out the permit the sisters would have needed would have cost up to $1,500 for the day, plus a $35 application fee. And in the 2 hours they were operating, they had brought in a total of $52, including tips. So the story drew some international headlines. It became known as Lemonade Gate. And to the NCC's credit, they made it right. So those girls got a permit the following weekend. The fees were waived, provided they donated their profits to charity, which they did. And the next summer, there was a program for young entrepreneurs like them. But those girls learned a lesson that many adult entrepreneurs face in Canada when it comes to barriers to entry. And I'm going to give you some examples from east to west. And just to be clear, these are illustrative. I'm not trying to say any of these would or would not fall under the Competition Act. I'm not trying to say that there's no policy justification for them. But they're examples of where businesses need permission to sell lemonade. So suppose those girls grow up and they want to use their entrepreneurial energy, enthusiasm to help solve food insecurity in Canada. So maybe they decide, we're going to open a low-cost grocery store in an underserved neighborhood. Well, if they pick the north end of Halifax, they may find that one of the reasons that area is underserved is because of long-standing property controls that limit the ability of new grocery stores to enter. And so to enter in that market with that business, they would need permission not from government, but from a national grocery chain that has a restrictive covenant because they used to be there in the 1980s. Now, Manitoba has actually taken the step of banning these types of property controls for grocery stores, but they're the only ones to do so. And the Bureau's been active in securing some outcomes as well under the Competition Act. But let's say the girls pivot and decide, we're going to do a food truck. Okay, well, they still are going to want to think carefully about where they decide to set up. If they pick Campbellton, New Brunswick, it's close to where I grew up, the fee for a non-resident to park a food truck is $500 an hour, up to a maximum of 10 hours a day. So over the course of a 100-day summer season, that would amount to $500,000 in fees. So you have to sell a crazy amount of poutine to be able to recoup that. And it's an extreme example, but there are others like it. Across the river in Gatineau, they only legalized food trucks in 2021. Okay, prior to that, they were not allowed under any condition outside of special events. So let's suppose, though, that maybe they say, you know, forget this, we're going to stay in Ottawa, and we're going to sell ice cream. Well, they'll want to think about what happened to the Mary Dairy. That's the ice cream shop in the neighborhood where I live. So they sell ice cream from their shop, they sell it from their truck, but they found out during the pandemic when a provincial inspector showed up, following up on an anonymous complaint, that they could not wholesale their pints to local retailers in the neighborhood without a special dairy plant license. And so they're not a dairy plant. They're a small owner-operated store. And so getting a dairy plant license has some fairly onerous conditions. It's more suited to a large seller selling across Canada, not a small player selling around the block. So overnight, they lost 15 wholesale accounts that were selling 300 to 400 pints of ice cream a week. But maybe dairy's just complicated because of food safety reasons, other reasons. Maybe they should just sell coffee in the GTA. Well, they'll want to consider what happened to Wheels & Co. This is a company started by a 27-year-old Ukrainian immigrant who bought a trailer and converted it to a mobile coffee shop. Thought that they had procured the right permits, licenses, but when a competitor complained, and it's usually a disgruntled competitor that complains, by the way, they found out that they didn't have the right license, and by law started imposing fines. Now, the issue they confronted was they needed a mobile vending permit, but the city can only issue one to a vehicle that has a motor. And that trailer doesn't have a motor. She pulls it around in her car. So she was caught in a limbo between not quite a pop-up tent, not quite a conventional food truck that has a motor. So there was no license for this business model. And we see this. If the rules had been written in a more technology-neutral kind of way, she might have had better luck. We see that a lot in the tech space, other spaces. So maybe surely if these sisters move west, they'll find greater economic freedom. They should be able to sell sandwiches in Lloydminster. Oh, didn't work. Well, I'll break it to you. Lloydminster is a special case. Lloydminster is a border city, which means it straddles Alberta and Saskatchewan. So if you want to sell food products within Lloydminster, even if you're only going a few blocks, you might be crossing a provincial boundary. And so that triggers a higher degree of food safety controls. So you literally might need a federal license to sell a ham sandwich in Lloydminster. Or at least you did. So this is actually one that has a good story. So last year, federal regulations were amended to exempt businesses operating in Lloydminster from this requirement. But it required a change. It required the regulator to do what was maybe a technical and thankless task, very localized impacts, but actually adjusting the rules to allow for more competition within Lloydminster. So I think we've now reached British Columbia. British Columbians are really laid back, they're chill, I think we all know that. So let's say these sisters want to start a high-end whiskey bar with some small plates, some food pairings aimed at connoisseurs. Well, they might find out that they have trouble building their ideal whiskey list because a few restaurants were raided in BC a few years ago for selling premium whiskeys that they had sourced from private BC retailers. So it turns out restaurants in BC have to source all of their liquor and wine from the BC Liquor Distribution Branch. So if provincial outlets are out of stock, or if they're on strike, or if there's niche products they don't carry, but that you can find in a private retailer, too bad. A consumer can go and purchase from those private retailers, but a restaurant can't to then sell to the consumer. So why is that? Why is that? And I could keep going with examples. Let's say these girls decide food and beverage and all this stuff's unhealthy, I'm going to get into a health profession. Well, then they'll encounter occupational licensing restrictions. It's hard to get into some of these professions. Once you're in, there's scope of practice restrictions. There's restrictions on your ability to market your services, suggested fee guides, right? There's restrictions on your ability to move between provinces. So maybe they say, to hell with all that, we're just going to work a 9 to 5, which many entrepreneurs unfortunately have done. But if they get the bug later in life, I want to spin off my own company in this field, I've learned a lot, they might be one of the millions of Canadians that's subject to a non-compete, right? And so they're almost never legally enforceable, which we learned this morning, but they're a hassle to fight. So a lot of people stay in a job they don't like, or they move to a whole new career, neither of which is good for productivity. So what all these examples have in common is they're all examples of requiring permission to sell lemonade in Canada, whether from one or more levels of government, from an incumbent competitor, from the profession, from your former employer, or other gatekeepers in the economy. So it makes for an economy that is not promoting broad-based economic participation, an economy that's more extractive and less inclusive. And not to be grim, but the situation's actually been getting worse. So there was a study, this is a chart adapted from a study published by StatCan earlier this year. It found that federal regulatory burden had increased by 37% between 2006 and 2021. And this was associated with a decline in business dynamism, a decline in GDP growth, a decline in business sector investment and decline in employment growth. And this is just federal regulatory burden. Vast majority of regulation for businesses is provincial in Canada. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business, which represents over 100,000 SMEs, they surveyed their members. They found the average business spends 32 business days dealing with what they view as red tape as opposed to necessary regulation. And this was an 8.6% increase over what these same members reported in 2020. That's $18 billion in compliance costs. And it's borne disproportionately by smaller businesses who have fewer employees to spread those costs over. So here's what I want to say, point out the obvious. We need regulation. This is not a call to deregulate. There's no question about that. Market failures are a real thing. It's why the Competition Bureau exists. It's why I have a job. But the way we regulate, how we regulate is important and has consequences. And hopefully the examples I'm sharing show that. And there's often ways to achieve a regulatory goal in a more inclusive, more competition-friendly way, if we try, if we're thinking about that when we design the regulation or when we evaluate it. But the problem is we haven't been very good about doing that. So the leading indicator that measures the extent to which a country's laws or regulations promote competition is the OECD Product Market Regulation Indicator. It's not perfect, but it's the one that's most cited. In 1998, Canada ranked 10th in the OECD on regulatory competitiveness. But over the years, our position has slided down to 26th. Meanwhile, the UK and some of our peers have maintained their competitive position. And if you look at what the UK has done in open banking, other pro-competitive regulations, it's apparent. And so the thing that I think, maybe to step back, that worries me the most about these two charts is path dependence. So the more that we are regulating in this way, the less competition we're going to have. And the less competition we're going to have, the more we're going to have a tendency to regulate this way, because the market is not providing what society needs or expects, but also because rent-seeking grows more and more prevalent and becomes harder and harder to resist. So I worry that we may be in a vicious cycle. One piece of evidence that seems to align with that is business dynamism. If you look at this chart on the left, it looks at entry-exit rates. They have halved over my lifetime. And that's not a sign of healthy competition. It's not good for investment and innovation. A study published by StatCan last year found that declining entry rates accounted for 30% of the decline in investment per worker since 2006. Another way to look at it is rank stability. This is from a study that the Bureau published 2 years ago, my colleagues. It measures how many of the top 10 firms in an industry have retained that position over the previous 3 years. That has increased. It means that the larger incumbents are being less and less challenged by newcomers. You can even look at it just by looking at the largest firms in Canada. The largest public companies by market cap in Canada, if you look at the top 20, they have an average founding year of 1916. So that means they're on average over 100 years old. So in every other country, almost every other country, the top firms are usually much younger, generations younger. So that's partly to do with the composition of our economy. It's heavily weighted towards the banks, oil and gas players, and railways. But it's also perhaps a sign that there's more creative destruction happening elsewhere. And if that's true, that has major implications for long-term prosperity. So I took a law and development class this summer, brushing up on that area. I read the book Why Nations Fail, which maybe some of you have read. It's by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. They won the Nobel Prize last year for their work on the drivers of inclusive growth. They find that the reason that some countries achieve sustained growth over the long term, whereas others stagnate, is not because of geography or culture or plain luck. It's because of institutions. In countries, nations that have inclusive institutions, ones that encourage investment, innovation, competition on a level playing field, grow. And those that do the opposite, that suppress those things, inevitably stagnate. And so, interestingly enough, an Oxford-trained economist made a very similar point in a book published a few years ago. The author identified dynamism as one of the 7 essential values, in fact. So important that countries must, quote, jealously guard and actively nurture the conditions that promote it. The book goes on to say that eternal vigilance in the name of competition is essential. The future will be made by entrepreneurs who we do not yet know. So the first step in solving a problem is recognizing you have one. The second is recognizing what the causes are. And then the third is to tackle those causes. And I think we're on step 3. I think we know we have a productivity problem, we know we have an affordability problem, and we know that competition is one of the main reasons we have it. So now we're focused on solutions, and I think that's why you're seeing policymakers rally around internal trade liberalization, even though it may be a partial answer to some problems. Why you're seeing so much momentum on red tape reduction. Why we heard the minister today say the government's going to be hawkish on competition. It's because there's big benefits to be had. Tens of billions, perhaps hundreds of billions in growth by some estimates. And by achieving this growth through competition, there's a better chance that those gains get shared with workers and consumers. But do Canadians want this? Yes, yes, they want this. So I always take polls with a grain of salt, but when you, but when you have multiple pollsters asking Canadians questions about competition in different ways at different times and finding the same results, I think you can start to draw insights from that. So the vast majority of Canadians want to see more competition. Vast majority of Canadians say they're experiencing problems due to a lack of competition, more than EU citizens. Vast majority of Canadians think that high concentration is at least part of the reason for higher prices. Vast majority of SMEs are finding it harder to compete against the rise of large corporate giants. Respondents prefer pro-competitive policies that help businesses succeed, and so on. And if you don't believe polls, another piece of evidence of this is that competition issues are breaking through in Parliament. Parliamentarians have finite time to talk about issues, so in principle, they are picking the ones that matter the most. And so you can go on openparliament.ca, as I've done here, and search competition-related words or phrases. Each of these is being used more in the last 2 years than at any other point on record. The data goes back to 1994. And not just a little bit more, they're being used like 100% more. And the Bureau is being called to testify before parliamentary committees at an unprecedented rate. And on a wide variety of issues, on food prices, telecom, transportation, banking, AI, SMEs. So to me, that's a sign that these issues parliamentarians are hearing about it from their constituents, from stakeholders, and they want to do something about it. And so recent Competition Act amendments kind of show that there's a consensus on this. If you were following this, we had a major overhaul of our competition law following years of advocacy, and those reforms were passed essentially unanimously, which is rare for any piece of legislation, but especially one where such consequential changes are being made. So I'm going to close on an optimistic note, coming back to my original theme, okay? So the world is handing us some lemons, okay? We have productivity challenges, affordability, we have an aging population, we have fractured trading relationships, we have a challenging fiscal outlook. But at the same time, we have abundant natural resources, okay? We have strong institutions, we have a diverse and talented workforce. So what do we do when life hands us lemons? Right? We make lemonade. We need to give permission to sell lemonade in Canada. What that means is a regulatory environment that's dynamic, inclusive, and competition-friendly, where new ideas and business models can flourish while at the same time keeping us safe. So let's continue to share ideas on how to get there in Canada. Thank you very much.